Hello and welcome to the No Ceilings NBA Draft Show. Today is a deep dives episode. I am your co-host Nick Agard-Johnson, and with me, as always, is my co-host Paige Otto. Paige, how are you doing this fine evening?
I'm doing great, Nick. There was sun today in Michigan for the first time in I don't know how long. The snow is melting. I could actually go outside with just a sweatshirt on. So it felt nice in February.
It is warmer where you are than where I am, which makes absolutely no sense.
Well, it's climate change.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
What a bright note to start off our episode.
I know. Climate change, weather. I mean, we're just a bunch of old heads, I guess.
We sure do live in a time, Paige. We
We
sure do
do.
live in a time.
We
Shall I
do.
get started with our first prospect?
Yeah, let's do it.
So we picked two older big men today, and other than that, they are two extremely dissimilar players. So I ended up going with, and this is wild to me as I realized after I selected him, St. John's has pulled into the lead for most players covered on deep dives this season, which would not have been my odds-on favorite heading
Yeah.
into the year. But I went with Zuby Ejiofor for my pick for today. And there's sort of a simple summary of why I ended up going with him, but I want to get your thoughts before I go into that. But the top line view for me is that Zuby Ejiofor has shown not just some improvement, but serious improvement in a couple of really important areas for his NBA translation. So, Paige, I'm curious with sort of where you were at with Zuby before this season and where you're at with him now at this point in the year for St. John's.
Yeah, so Zuby, he's a 6'9", 245-pound, kind of this undersized big man, but also he fits in that modern big man style in the NBA that you're kind of looking for. He has great processing ability. He's great as a point of attack defender, perimeter defender. Also, I think he really loves these guard matchups, Nick. I mean, he kind of like takes it to him, like he's looking for those. Like he's not scared. Like he's kind of like, oh, you have to guard me now. Like basically like an NFL defensive end that he's also extremely light on his feet. And you quickly mentioned, his improvement over the years too. I mean, and his assist rate, 21.8 assist rate is absurd for a big man, especially being undersized as well. And he is such a great processor. I mean, we've talked over the past few months on deep dives how me and you both love good basketball players, right? That can process their processing ability just off the charts. They're just a great basketball player in general. And yes, in terms of the shot, it's not really there, right? He's not really reliable in that sense, but he does everything so well, Nick. And especially when, you're playing with the likes of Bryce Hopkins and Dylan Mitchell, that also opens up space for him as well, since he's not, your typical back to the basket floor spacer big man, right? He can kind of play off the perimeter a lot more. Most of his play types too are on the post-up possessions, right? But that kind of concerns me in a way, because if you're looking at his role type and archetype at the next level, he's not going to get a lot of possessions in there, just because of, what he is as a player, but that's where he is most effective. But with his playmaking ability, his feel for the game, he can impact so many ways on the court, especially on the defensive end too, as he's just a monster on the glass as well. It definitely opens up so much for him. But a lot of his offensive production comes from those, offensive rebounding ability that he has in putbacks, which, is a plus when, you're talking about a 6'9", 245-pound guy that is just resilient at attacking the glass. And I think, he kind of thinks Rick Pitino for that, right? And just having that mentality too. But he's such a high IQ, high feel player, Nick, that I have a hard time kind of betting against him at the next level, which makes it hard too, because if you're looking at his shot, right, it's not really there, right? But he's so great at drawing fouls too against typical big man. I mean, we saw against, UConn, right, with Terrace Reed, right? I mean, he did have some trouble with, Reed's length and size at the rim, but he was great at, drawing fouls against him, making him run a little bit around. And because he is so effective on the perimeter, and he does have a great handle for his size too, that makes him so much more effective, especially in the open court and half court too.
So, two things. You mentioned the main area that I wanted to get to in terms of the improvement in the playmaking, which I probably would have picked Dylan Mitchell if you asked me at the start of the season who's going to lead St. John's in assists. I would not have
Yeah.
picked Zuby Ejiofor.
Yeah.
And they have run so much of the offense through him this season. And, he's, as you mentioned, he's always had good feel, good sort of IQ around the game. But as recently as last year, he had a negative assist to turnover ratio. And so I was fully not expecting him to turn into this, playmaking hub offensively. And I'm really glad that you mentioned just how much he loves taking it to smaller guards, because that is the only sort of, not even disagreement, but thought that it might go a different way in terms of his NBA offense. Because the one thing that might lead teams to actually let him get post possessions is what you mentioned of the sort of dual thing of, if he gets someone like a smaller guard switched onto him, you can absolutely destroy that guy. And the flip side of it is, and this is something we've talked about many, 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 many times before, but unless you're Joel Embiid, a lot of post-up offense in today's NBA is either mismatch hunting or getting the ball to guys who are playmaking hubs. And the fact that Zuby Ejiofor has gone from, yeah, he's a fine connective piece, and maybe he'll make some good passes, maybe he'll make some mistakes, but there is such a leap from that kind of connective piece to, oh, you can actually run the offense through this guy. And the shooting is one reason that the comp doesn't particularly work, but a lot of what I love about Zuby Ejiofor's playmaking that he's shown this year is what I loved about Deron Holmes, who, as you may well remember, is one of my favorite players I've ever scouted.
Mhm.
And, a lot of it with Deron was his, steady, consistent, real improvement as a shooter over the course of his time in college. And, that's not quite where Zuby's at. But, I mean, you mentioned the free throws. He's leading the Big East in free throws, and that's something that the other thing you mentioned that I want to get back to is his offensive rebounding. Here's a stat for you. Zuby Ejiofor is 12th in offensive rebounding percentage in the history of the Big East.
Oh my God.
The history of the Big East Conference. And so it's like, yeah, okay, his offensive rebounding rate is down a little bit this year, but first of all, a huge part of that is because he's playing with Dylan Mitchell now. But also, yeah, his offensive rebounding rate has gone down, and he's still literally 12th in the 47, whatever it is, almost 50-year history of the Big East Conference. It's hard
absurd.
to overstate how absurd of a number that is, but I'm just going to keep bringing it up because it's fun. But, with sort of what he's shown, the offensive holes that you brought up are real and important, but it's hard for me to get past the fact that, this is someone who I flirted with, having in my second round last year. And for him to, and we'll get to the defensive stuff in a minute, but for him to take the leap that he's taken as a playmaker, it genuinely changes the trajectory of his potential NBA future in my mind.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to mention too, with his absurd 21.8 assist rate too, he also has a 6.6 block rate and a 2.3 steal rate too. I mean, this guy is everywhere on the court, and the reads he makes, Nick, are, it's not just, the singular read here. It's the first, the second, and third read, and most of them are on the move too. And a lot of them come when, he's doubled on the perimeter or blitzed, and he just has that perfect court vision, and it's just effortless to him to, hit the open cutter. And a lot of, I think, his uptick in production on the playmaking side too is because he is such a beast on the offensive glass, is that he's able to, kick out his offensive rebounds to open shooters and cutters, and he's constantly looking to make plays for his teammates. And with Dylan Mitchell's cutting ability too, right, and Bryce Hopkins' ability, I love when they all three of them play together. It's kind of like, how do we guard these guys? Because yes, they're kind of not your typical big man, but when they play together, they play so well off of each other. And I think at the next level too, having another big man that is such a high IQ field player that, he can play off of, will just maximize his ability, at the next level too, because he is such an all around player in terms of, his processing ability, his feel. And that's a guy you want to play with, right. And it's hard not to, the concerns are, he's not exceptionally good at one offensive trait. Like you could say his shot or anything, right? But you can't really say that. But then you're like, well, he does all these things really great. So it's kind of like, what do you really do with him at the next level? How is he going to, create his shot for himself, but he does have that dribble that I talked about, earlier, that, a lot of guys at his size don't really have that at that level that he does. And he can do it in so many ways because he can play off the perimeter. He's very comfortable off there. And one thing I will say is that when he's, matched up onto these true, throwback type bigs, is that, he'll carry them out to the perimeter a little bit, work in space, and then he'll attack because he does have such a lethal drop step. He uses his physicality to get to the rim. His finishing numbers could be a little bit better, Nick. I think he's like a sub less than 60% at the rim, which, isn't great for, his size and archetype, which I would like that to be better. But since he is so great at drawing fouls, getting to the free throw line, I think his free throw rate is like 83.6 or something like that, which is absurd. And you mentioned, in the history of the Big East, with him being there, there's a lot to like with Zuby. So I'm glad that that you picked him for this episode to talk about.
So the first thing that I wanted to talk about as his outlier growth was the offensive playmaking. Second part, which you also already mentioned, was the defensive playmaking. And, he technically had higher block percentages when he barely played in his first 2 college seasons. This is his highest steal rate of his career. And it's one of those things where, again, you and I have talked about this before, of it is possible, and not only possible, but, relatively common to have guys who have really high steal rates because they just gamble on every play, and they actually end up hurting you defensively more than they end up helping you because, they're just gambling every time. And 2 out of 10 times that's a steal, and 8 out of 10 times that's an easy layup for the other team, right? So that's one thing. The thing is, though, with Zuby, as you mentioned, he's already got that sort of perimeter stopper, both the want to and the ability in terms of that sort of stuff. And so when you see those defensive playmaking improvements and look at the film and say, this is not a guy who's gambling more. This is just someone who's making better decisions as a shot blocker. Like, despite, all of the above, his block rate has, he's fouling slightly more this year, but the growth in, stocks, as it were, dramatically outpaces his growth in terms of personal fouls. Like, he's gone from 2.5 to 2.6. It's like, not the end of the world. So there are some holes with the offense, which we sort of touched on a little bit, and I do want to circle back on. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, with the improvements in his playmaking on both ends of the floor, certainly the offensive playmaking is the bigger leap. I don't want to understate that. I mean, again, it's rare that you see a guy go from, sort of involved peripherally in the offense to literally the guy they run the offense through. And so, that's clearly the bigger leap. But you mentioned some of his offensive skill set, and I do really want to drill into that for a moment, because the one thing that I think he's really suffered from this year is St. John's basically just does not use him in transition. Like, they have him as the trail guy, and it's like, if they don't get a transition opportunity, like if Dylan Mitchell doesn't race out in front of the floor and, get like 3 feet above the rim and like throw it down with his feet or whatever, like they're not giving those transition opportunities to Zuby because it doesn't make much sense for the offense, right? But other than this year, he has never been below the 85th percentile as a transition player. And I think that speaks to his athleticism, his awareness, and of course the fact, as you mentioned, his combination of handle and literally historic rebounding ability makes him the kind of big that you can trust to push the ball up the floor as a playmaker, right? Not just, oh, I'm going to run out on the wings and, point guard can hit me with the lob if it's a 2-on-1, but I'm not pushing the pace. I'm not bringing the ball up myself. Zuby can do that. And really the main question is one that you've already brought up, and I think I'm slightly more optimistic about than you are, but really it's, will he get those opportunities to make plays out of the post? Because transition aside, him, and he's still, 69th percentile this year. Mm-hmm. It's not like he's gone to terrible in that regard, right? But he's been elite at it every year before this year. And I think that's a lot more to do with usage than him like losing a step or whatever. But That is really the question for me, is how much will teams allow him to post up smaller guys? Because that's the kind of thing where, man, you can run those plays through him and it looks a lot better than it would for most big men. But most teams don't have that kind of offense. And so it's one of those things where maybe he's one of these players that's a lot more valuable to some teams than others, just because if you're not going to use his incredible gifts as a passer, then you're kind of not maximizing what you've got with him.
Yeah, I think fit is very, very important for, Zuby's future. And then depending on, what team he goes to, it can either, maximize, his natural gifts or, kind of not have him, play, his type of basketball, which if that doesn't happen, then you're kind of looking at like this, is he just going to get a cup of coffee in the NBA or he could be, a guy that stays in league for, 8+ years, right? So that's kind of the difference of, is he going to a team that really maximizes, his skill set with their system and their players? Because I think he feeds off of players that know his skill set, right? And they're not trying to force anything out of him because he is such, a high feel, trustworthy player. And especially on the film, Nick, I mean, he's telling, Hopkins, Mitchell, Darling, where to go on the court. He's very vocal and you see his leadership abilities, time and time again on tape, which I think is, a great quality as well that he, naturally possesses as well. And then one thing I will say too, back to kind of the offensive end too, is that he's so good at stealing big man and getting into position without fouling, which is a skill in itself because, because he is so physical, that can sometimes be hard because you're overempowering. You don't know how strong you actually are, but he does know, and he uses it to the best of his ability and he capitalizes on it. I mean, that's why his free throw rate is so high for, his archetype, right? That's why he's getting to the free throw line so much too. And then I don't think, we mentioned his, numbers for the year, but just for, people that are just tuning in now, it's February, people are kind of getting more locked in with the draft, college basketball in general. So just a quick rundown there. He's averaging, 16.3 points per game, 7.5 rebounds, 3.5 assists on 53.9, 33.3, and 70.2 shooting splits. And then the last 5 games too, he's had games with 5 assists, 7, 4, 5, and 4. So, I mean, he doesn't back down from anything. And I think his ability to play off the perimeter, I mean, we're seeing this, as years go on, is that teams really utilize big man that can be an offensive hub and it can also create for themselves. And that's such a uptick in, most recent years. I feel like we talk about it all the time on deep dives, but it's so true. I mean, even with the next prospect that we're going to talk about, later, is that he has some of those qualities as well that, really make evaluators and front offices kind of be like, okay, we can use him in so many different schemes, complex schemes, even simple schemes. And we can, run the offense through him because he can bring the ball up. He is such a great screener. He can, play, he forces rotations, which is absurd for him as well, just because he kind of looks for that too. And, he can just capitalize in every single way with whichever position he's put in.
In St. John's game against UConn, Zuby Ejiofor had, get ready, 21 points on 6 of 10 from the field, and he made the only 3-pointer he took, 8 of 10 from the free throw line, 10 rebounds, 7 assists, 2 steals, 3 blocks. It's hard to ask for much more, honestly. But speaking of asking for much more and, completely stomping on the point that I just made, where are you at with his shot? Because it's clearly, it's a small sample size thing. He doesn't take many jump shots. Pretty much all of the jumpers he does take are, essentially trail threes. But it's one of those things where, he grades out in the 81st percentile on synergy this season. Again, 39 shots, so it's not, a non-existent sample size. It's not enough for me to draw any sort of real conclusions on. Looking at the film, he's got a bit of a slow release. It's not the most consistent, but it's not broken. Like compared to his teammate Dylan Mitchell, right? Especially, also the fact that Zuby has been consistently a 70% free throw shooter. And when I say consistently, I mean he's shooting 70.2% from the free throw line this season. And for his college career, he is shooting 70.2% from the free throw line. So, again, he's getting to the line at an absolutely insane rate. He's not knocking down all of them, but he's clearly got, solid enough touch. And again, it's the kind of thing where, small sample size aside, he has upped his 3-point attempt rate every year of his college career. He took exactly 0 during his freshman year at Kansas and then 8 in his sophomore year. And, he's been hovering at 1.5 per game for each of the last 2 years. I guess where I'm at with it is I wouldn't bet on the shot, but also I think there's, room for optimism, especially if he ends up on a team that is going to use him similar to St. John's in the sense of, hey, you're our trail guy, and if you're wide open from 3, take it. And if you can, post up a guard and play make out of the post from, 15 to 18 feet, take it. And if you get a free lane to the rim, take it, right? But that's the kind of thing where I don't even want to call it a swing skill because I don't want to bet on it to the point where I would consider it that. That being said, again, there's something to work with there, right? He's got decent enough touch, and imperfect as the form may be, it's not broken. So I wouldn't be stunned if, say 5 years from now, he's hitting like 33% on like 2 threes a game. The thing is, though, I would be concerned if a team is relying on him to shoot from out there.
Yeah.
Like it's sort of a ceiling growth kind of thing, even though we don't have ceilings around here. It's sort of a let's hope that this figures itself out, that he can get to this point. But also, like, beyond, I wouldn't draft him to be a shooter, which is a relatively obvious thing to say. I'm not sure it matters as much for him when teams are, especially given how ridiculous he is as an offensive rebounder, teams might not want to space him out from beyond the arc. So, maybe it's the kind of thing where, hey, if you're wide open in transition, go ahead and take it. But teams probably want to position him closer to the basket, even if they're not using him out of the post as a post playmaking hub. I think there are, other reasons that you want to have that guy around the basket able to clean up mistakes.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think, for career wise, he's shooting near 28% from 3 on, he's taking 86 attempts in his career. He's 40% off the catch, 44% or 40% off spot ups, 44% off the catch. But the sample size is so small. I mean, he's only taken, 33 3-point attempts this year. He took 45 last year and 8 the year prior. I wouldn't bet on it, right? It's more of like a skill that if he has it and it's improving, okay, we're cool with you taking, wide open spot up, right? But we want you, by the basket, post up opportunities, crashing the glass. And he's such a great foul baiter, Nick, is that it's like, okay, Zuby, get in there and do your thing, right? I don't think teams are going to be reluctant to, have him space the floor as much as, obviously other archetypes and players. I think teams are going to look at, okay, this is who he is. This is how he plays. We're going to maximize his strengths and not put him in positions where, he might score, on the perimeter. His shot isn't broken by any means. I do agree that his release point and kind of, it's very clunky. In my sense, it's very slow. I don't think they're going to be like, okay, this guy's going to be, a sub 40% shooter in the NBA. That's just not, his trajectory as of right now. Not saying, it could never happen. I don't want to say that about any prospect, but from what, we've seen in his career, it's not, the tip of the iceberg, right? But I think for him, if he just shows a little bit more, I mean, you mentioned most of his 3-point attempts are, in transition, right? Or kind of the guy that's kind of just coming up the court in those delay actions, right? Which, is a good, 3-point shot as well that, you look for in terms of, shot trajectory and people and prospects that are just, now improving their 3-point shot. And, he's continuing to have that, but the sample size is still too small to kind of say, like, is it reliable? Can it be consistent? So that's kind of where I'm at with his shot.
Yeah, agreed. And again, small sample size, etc. the split between his guarded and unguarded catch and shoot numbers is larger than it is for most players, and that tracks completely with exactly what you just said. Yeah, if he's got time and space to load up, you know, again, small sample size, but he's making them, right?
Yeah.
But I do want to get back to the elephant in the room, which you mentioned earlier, which is his at rim numbers. And so, he's at 58%, which is not fantastic for a player of his archetype. What concerns me a lot more than that is he's barely above 50% on layups. And that's the kind of thing where, the foul baiting does play a role in that, right? Like I think his, percentage on layups would be a bit higher if he wasn't trying to throw wild stuff off the glass and hopefully get a foul call on it. But again, that's the kind of thing where it doesn't really track with his touch in other areas of the game. And the fact that he's got 22 dunks on the year really helps out that at rim percentage because, he's making most of his dunks, right? Not quite on the layups, but I really don't know where to fall on that, to be entirely honest, because last year Zuby converted 60% of his layups, 67% of his shots at the rim. The year before that, he was awful. He made 36% of his layups. And granted, that was a much smaller sample size than either last year or this year. But I think that history has told us that he is much more like the finisher he's been this year than the finisher he was last year. Like as time goes on this season, it's seeming more and more clear to me that, he was on the high end of the range in terms of what he was converting last year. So, that's not the best. That's also the only area I can think of in which he's regressed. And his crazy leap as a playmaker more than makes up for that in my mind.
Yeah. The at the rim numbers are kind of like, what is going on? Like Zuby is so aggressive and fierce. He's a freight train, coming down the lane. He has great counters on the post. I think it's really a length thing, Nick, with big man. I mean, and some of his finishes at the rim, they're not crazy or anything. He just really struggles because once he, drops his shoulder, has, 2 hard pound dribbles, and then he has to go up. The Terrace Reeds of the world, the Henri Veesaars of the world are going to block that or at least deflect it and cause, disruption there for a bad shot, which most of the time it does happen. So I think that's more reluctant of, you mentioned the free throw foul baiting, obviously, take into account with, his finishing numbers at the rim, but that also I think has to deal with it because we saw that with the UConn game too. A couple of times, Terrace met him right there a lot of the times. And it's kind of like, okay, how am I supposed to score against this guy? But, you see him, since he's so good at drawing mismatches, is that when he gets into space a little bit more on the perimeter, then he makes a lot of his finishes at the rim. But when he's really just on the block or, the left block, right block, and in synergy, it's very equally accounted from, the middle, the left and right block. He can kind of work all around the dunker spot and post, which is also a good sign too. It doesn't matter if, he's not, one-sided compared to the other in that regard. But I think that's really, it comes down to it is that he does struggle at the rim in terms of length and especially athleticism too, above the rim.
Yeah, it's interesting because in a weird way, he's not a bad vertical athlete, to be clear, but I think he thinks he's better than he is. Because there have been a number of, sort of blown tire layups this year where it's like he clearly is like going up like he thinks he's about to flush it. And he's like, not quite there. And then, sometimes he still manages to convert. And other times he like floats something weird up. He's like, I thought I had it. And not quite. But again, I mean, that's, it's a big deal for a kind of player that has the offensive profile that he has. And certainly something for him to hopefully clean up. Again, I'm just at a place which is, circling back, very similar to what you said when we were starting out of he is just such a high IQ player who makes such good decisions on both ends of the floor that it's almost weirder to me than it would be for most other players that he's got that sort of blown tire frequency at the rim. But again, he can throw down a few more dunks and maybe, when he's not the engine of the offense, he won't be as aggressively trying to draw fouls and maybe that makes the layups easier.
Yeah, and one other prospect that we talked about earlier in deep dives this year, Joshua Jefferson from Iowa State, right? They have very similar, body frames and sizes, right? But Joshua Jefferson, I think, is an unreal playmaker. Obviously, Zuby, is too, but I think Joshua is a little bit better in that sense, and just in terms of his all around impact. But they have how they see the game and feel the game. You're like, I don't want to bet against this guy. Like, yeah. I don't want to look like a fool if I do, because they're so good and they're so naturally gifted at those things that you can't teach, that you don't want to be the one person that's like, why did I do that? So that's kind of where I'm at with Zuby.
I am not going to subtweet anyone here, but there are player archetypes that I am not willing to bet on. Zuby Ejiofor is not one of them.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, shall we move on to player number 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so Paige, you decided to go with UNC's Henri Veesaar for this week. So take the floor. What made you decide to go with Henri Veesaar for today?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know what else Henri Veesaar has to do to be, a first round lock at this point. I mean, he's a 7-footer, originally from Estonia, 225 pounds, will be 22 on draft night. His numbers are absurd if you, are those types of evaluators that, are very stat oriented. 60.6 points per game, 9.1 rebounds, to assists per game on 62.6, 46, and 62.1 shooting splits. And with him, Nick, he can rim run, he can pick and pop, he can catch and shoot. He's great off the ball and with the ball in his hands too. He's very mobile and versatile. And especially, when you're playing with the likes of Caleb Wilson, I think that's also maximized in terms of, his defensive capabilities, because coming into the season, he transferred from Arizona. There were some talks about, can he defensive rebound? Can he offensive rebound? Because his numbers were kind of down. And then this year, he proved that. But I also think with the likes of Caleb Wilson, you have, his elite athleticism, his defensive ground advantage, right? That also helps, Henri in that sense. And I think those have to do with, his uptick in numbers and production too. But in the NBA, you're going to be playing with tons of players that, help maximize your skill set. Obviously, Caleb Wilson is a, one-of-one type of player, but, he's going to be surrounded with, those types of players in the NBA world, especially with, this modern stretch of, the double bigs, right, that can play off of each other. I think that's where he can be utilized. And I just love him, Nick, honestly. I mean, and he's career 73% at the rim. He can finish, through contact. He has great length as well. He can also play off the perimeter, and he has great footwork on the post as well. And he's just been a joy to watch this year. And especially from, the pre-notions coming in. I mean, he's proved that, he can, do it all basically. So I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on him so far.
So other than a couple of minor nitpicks, I really don't have anything negative to say about his offense. He's an exceptionally gifted scorer. He's, extremely versatile in terms of the offensive sets that you can run with him on the floor. He's here. I'm going to read off some numbers for you real quick. So 97th percentile on all field goal attempts, 98th percentile as a jump shooter, 95th percentile at the rim, 94th percentile in transition, 94th percentile as a cutter, 91st percentile on spot up plays. There are a few more numbers that I can read that are not, in the 90s, so they don't really, sing off the page as much as the ones that I've already read. But again, very, 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 very few questions about pretty much anything on the offensive end of the floor. All of my questions with Henri Veesaar are defensive. Yeah. Every single one of them. I don't know what position he plays at the NBA level. You mentioned the rebounding. The rebounding he's done great. The decline in offensive rebounding rate to me can be almost entirely attributed to the fact that he's playing with Caleb Wilson now. Yeah. And so he's not the only person who's going to be monopolizing the offensive glass. So I want to get that out of the way up front that I'm not worried about the rebounding stuff at all. I just, again, it's all defensive concerns. Can he slide his feet well enough to be a 4? I don't quite think so. Can he be a good enough rim protector to be a 5? I don't quite think so. And so then, a lot of this comes into play of, okay, if you pair him with the right guy, he's lethal. And if you don't pair him with the right guy, he's also lethal, but not in the good way. He's lethal to you, right? If you stick him on an island defensively. So I have wavered quite a bit on Henri Veesaar this season. And again, it's almost exclusively defensively because I just don't know where his NBA home is. And that makes it a lot more difficult for me to sort of project, okay, all of the wonderful things that he does offensively, are they going to play if he can't get on the floor because coaches don't want to risk him defensively? And it's not like, he's some turnstile defensively, all right? I don't want to overstate the point, but it is the primary and secondary and tertiary concern that I have with what does Henri Veesaar look like at the NBA level.
No, I think we're agreeing on the sense of, if he's paired with this elite athlete, defensive chaos disruptor, defensive playmaker, kind of like, a Jalen Duren in the NBA, that he's going to be maximized to his full capability. So it's kind of like, okay, if we take Caleb Wilson out of the equation, how is he, as a defensive prospect? I do have concerns because, like you, I think he is obviously not positionless, but it's kind of like, I don't really trust him, on full-blown big man. I don't really trust him on stretch 4s. I don't really trust him on the perimeter. It's kind of like my same thought process with, Ade Mara, right? Because, when I saw him at Michigan, I was like, oh my goodness, like he is so skilled offensively, has great feel as a playmaker, right? But he cannot guard on the perimeter. Like I do not trust him just because of his mobility, right? And his footwork and his lateral quickness. That's not gonna, he can't hide that as much, at the NBA level because you're just gonna be around those great insane great athletes all the time at the NBA level and in college, when you're playing with the likes of, Yaxel, obviously Morez Johnson too, right? You have same with Veesaar, they're playing with these hype impact players that really maximize their level, right? So it's kind of like I don't know what to do with him on the defensive end, but I think since he is so skilled on the offensive end, Nick, that I think he is going to make a path for him on the NBA level just because he can do so much with the ball in his hands, and he's great on those complex schemes too. I mean, Hubert Davis, just because he has the likes of Caleb Wilson and obviously Henri Veesaar as well. He can run these complex actions. One of my favorite sets that they ran was against Syracuse when they kind of did this double drag action with Caleb Wilson and Henry as the stagger screeners, and then they came back to do the pick and roll, but instead of a typical Spain action or whatever, Wilson set the screen, he rolled, and Veesaar, he kind of did a brush screen and ran out. So it's kind of like a split action in that sense. And then if you're guarding Henry, you're like, what is going on? Like this guy is just moving all over the court, right? And it's so difficult to keep up with him just because, he's so effective at the rim, career 73%, he can shoot all over the court at the absurd level, catch and shoot, pick and pop actions, delay actions, and also as a rim runner too. It's kind of like, what do I do with this guy on the offensive end? On the flip side, it's like Henry couldn't guard himself. So it's kind of like, how is that going to work, at the NBA level when, he's guarding, the cats of the world, or if he switched on, guards, because like, if you look at Zuby too, obviously they're complete different, archetypes, but it's like, I can put Zuby on a Steph Curry or like a Cade Cunningham or, whatever. But Henry, it's kind of like, okay, get him off. We got to switch immediately. So in those situations, he is a liability. But I think his offensive skill set, I think he will carve out, it would be an easy first round grab still for me at this point of the season for him.
Yeah, again, I don't want to overstate the point here either, and fully acknowledge they have very, very different games. But I think the logic behind doubting Henri Veesaar is similar to Boban Marjanovic. Of if we put this guy out there on the floor, we're going to have the best offensive rating in the NBA. And then the question is, are we even worse defensively to the point where it's not worth it to put the guy out there? And I mean, Boban almost had a decade-long NBA career, and when it was going well for Boban, that differential was like his first year in San Antonio, they had an offensive rating of 130 when he was on the floor and a defensive rating of 96.
Wow.
And so, again, it's one of those things where in small doses, in the right situations, he was spectacularly effective. His defensive rating never dipped below 100 again, right? And it's not like he was torched defensively. I mean, even over the course of his career, he had a dramatically positive net rating, but he had a dramatically positive net rating because he wasn't getting used unless it was the very rare kind of situation where it worked. And so it's one of those things where if we're talking about Henri Veesaar as just a prospect, generally speaking, getting him in the second round, getting that kind of player who plays almost a decade and is a really valuable sort of 11th man sort of bit player in the right situations, that's great second round value. That's not the best first round value, especially if you're looking earlier on in the first.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm a little bit higher on him than you. I think I believe more in just his overall impact at the NBA level because I have him at 27 right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know off the top of your head where you have him?
I believe I have him somewhere in the 40s, but don't quote me on that.
Okay, so that's kind of a big jump compared to me.
Yeah.
But just because how the game is going now with big man that can play make or high IQ, add in that they have a handle, they can shoot off the catch, they can create a shot for themselves too, and can also be a force in transition and can act as that rim runner, and then add in that plus wingspan, can finish around the rim, and then against Duke too. I mean, he scored against Cam Boozer in like 6 straight possessions or something like that too. So and obviously that's kind of take that with a grain of salt too. But I mean, and the thing with him too on the post ups too is that because he has that length and size, is that he has your typical counters of a drop step or a spin move, a couple pound dribbles, but it's not like he's taking like turnaround jumpers or off the dribble jumpers a lot in the mid range to Nick, which I think he's very capable of doing even so more. But I think that's another aspect of his game too that can get him more minutes on the floor as well. But I just really like him, and I think like when you're looking at when Kristaps kind of came into the league too, because I think that's kind of like his ceiling in a way, just because Kristaps obviously is a way better rim protector prospect than Henri Veesaar was. But I could kind of see him in that role, right, moving forward. And especially, with Golden State, picking up a big man of him too. It's kind of like he's the sole big man. How is he going to, improve? He doesn't have, the Mitchell, not Mitchell Robinson. I'm thinking about the Knicks and Celtics, but it's kind of like, okay, he's the sole big man here. How does he, maximize his skill set when he doesn't have, that elite athlete, chaos disruptor to, play off of, which I think Veesaar, does not necessarily 100% need, but it definitely works in his favor if he has that, guy to play off of.
So I like the Warriors Kristaps comparison. I just want to go on my old man corner for one little moment here and just say I had the privilege of watching Knicks Kristaps live when I still lived in the New York area. There has been nobody who could take guys off the dribble at 7'3" like that until Victor Wembanyama.
Yeah.
Henri Veesaar does not have that kind of handle. And, I'm not saying that to denigrate him. It's just Kristaps, early career Kristaps before he got hurt was on a Hall of Fame path. And so, if you're talking about him now where he's nowhere near as mobile as he was, absolutely, totally get the comp. But I did just want to get on my soapbox for one little minute and remind people, if you've forgotten, just look up some of the Knicks film on Kristaps because it's some of the wildest stuff you'll see, and you'll look at it and be like, this should have happened 10 years later. Like he was, other than Ralph Sampson, my other co-host Ray would not forgive me if I didn't at least mention Ralph Sampson here, but like nobody at that size moved the way that he did until Wemby. And Veesaar's not quite that. But I do want to get back into the positives because, again, I think the difference in our evaluation is with the one nitpick that I mentioned earlier, which I'll get to, and then we'll get back to all the positive stuff. But I think it's really just a difference in defensive evaluation of, I just think I'm more worried about that than you are, which is why I don't have him higher. But I do want to get to my one nitpick offensively, which is it's weird to me that his free throw percentage has gone down every year.
Mm-hmm.
And it's particularly weird that someone who's in the 98th percentile as a jump shooter is shooting 62% at the free throw line on a healthy number of attempts. Form doesn't look bad. It's just, I don't get it. And like, especially, watching him take jumpers is like, he has one of the smoothest forms you'll ever see on a 7-footer. And it's quick release and it's a high release. And it's one of those things where, okay, his shooting track record in terms of volume was not all that high before this year. Do I think he's a 46% three-point shooter? No. Do I think he's high 30s, maybe even low 40s, and that his improvement is legitimate and real? Yes. Does the free throw numbers being as weird as they are give me pause on that? Absolutely. And that is my one nitpick with his offensive game is I don't know what's going on there, but man, he has such a pretty jump shot. And, it's one of those things where, again, with that kind of high release and speed and willingness and ability to get it off from pretty much anywhere, like that's impressive for a guy half a foot taller than him. And so for him to do that is really, again, it's insanely impressive. And, you mentioned the versatility. That's huge for him. But really, again, it's like maybe he's not quite like a 45, 46% three-point shooter, but he's been in the 70s from 2-point range, and around the rim, as you already mentioned, like his entire college career. That his finishing around the basket, unlike Zuby's, that is a clear point in his favor that I have absolutely no concerns about.
And one thing I want to mention too, Nick, is that he's playing the most minutes he's ever played in his career per game. 30 minutes per game, highest usage rate as well at 22.1% career 20. So like a little bit uptick too. But I think he, with coming from North Carolina, and I think, he was the same prospect at Arizona, but I think coming to North Carolina is just maximized more because, he's with Caleb Wilson. But even last year too, I was like, this guy, he's legit. And I think he, I don't think, as you mentioned, he's a stable, 46% from three. I think he's more in that, 37-ish, 38 kind of range. But I mean, the numbers don't lie because, you mentioned he has such a pretty true shot. And it's so effortless, especially with, his high release points. He's great. Getting balanced, his and his feet set as well. And he can also do it in complex actions too. And I think that is for a big man to, be able to be that kind of movement shooter too is absurd at his size as a 7-footer too, that you can't ignore when it comes to his shooting capability. But his free throw numbers are, you kind of gotta, look at them as the season goes on. But I think if, that improves and his shooting, remains consistent, then, when it comes draft time, I think he's going to be, a real, first round grab for NBA teams.
Yeah, it's interesting to sort of figure out the offensive profile of stuff because, as you mentioned, because of just the everything that he could do on the offensive end, right? It just makes it so much easier to run sets that work because, it's something that we've talked about before, and I know we will talk about again, of as the NBA starts to trend to more and more quote unquote positionless play, it's more about just, okay, here are the boxes that we need checked in every lineup and who's going to check those boxes. And with Veesaar, it's like most, if really almost all of the offensive boxes that you could hope for a 7-footer, he's going to check. Pick and roll, not quite as insanely efficient as some of his other offensive play types, which is why I didn't state it earlier when I went through the rundown of everything that he's 90th percentile at or better, right? But, again, you want him to roll? Great. You want him to pop? Fantastic. He's, as I already mentioned, an excellent cutter. He's a really, really great post-up guy. I don't think he's going to get many of those chances at the NBA level, but similar to Zuby, right? Of, hey, if they throw a guard on him because, they want to have someone cover him on the perimeter, he's going to destroy that guy. And he's, not quite the same level of post playmaker that Zuby has become, but he's a good passer. He's a solid connected passer, right? He's not, throwing insane dimes all over the court, but he makes good choices. He makes the right reads. He can fill out a lot of plays for offenses that, run whatever actions that involve him, right? He's a screener, or, he's cutting from, station him in the corner, have him cut in from there. There are a lot of different things that he can do offensively that just makes it easier to construct lineups around him. And, that's really helpful for any player, but particularly for one who I have as many defensive questions about. It's like, if the right team that can cover for his defensive warts gets to pick him, similar to what he's showing at UNC alongside Caleb Wilson this year, right? If you get the right guy alongside him, he will do damage.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think with him too, I'm curious actually, Nick, this question has popped in my mind. If, what would be the best fit for Henri Veesaar in your mind?
I mean, this is cheating, but my answer for every big man of Henri Veesaar's archetype is the Spurs.
Yeah.
Right? It's like put him on the Spurs or put him on the Thunder, and Wemby or Chet will cover for him. And I don't want to overstate the case of his defense, right? You don't need a generational guy for him to work, but you need someone like that who's both big and mobile, who can be the shot blocker, who can cover whoever the quicker guy is, who can, make up a lot of ground defensively that Veesaar really can't. And then that guy would allow Veesaar to basically just, hey, station him around the rim, have him be a drop big, essentially have him be like a stretch 4 on one end and a drop big 5 on the other end. And the thing is, every year there are more and more NBA teams that can make that work, because there are more and more absolute freaks of nature like Wemby or Chet Holmgren or Evan Mobley who can do all of those things defensively. And so it's one of those things where if I were making a team specific big board, he would probably be a first round guy for me for the Spurs. But, for the league in general, this is also cheating in the exact opposite direction, right? But pair him, put him on the Kings, and it's like Maxime Reynaud, Domantas Sabonis, and Henri Veesaar. That team gives up 7,000 points in the paint every single game. So, again, it's one of those things where there are a lot of players who are a specific fit in the sense of it might work here, period, and he might not be an NBA player, period, if he goes to this spot. I don't think it's that dramatic with Veesaar because, again, his offensive floor is so insanely high, but you really need a lot of defensive pieces to make that work in my mind. And again, I think the, significant, if not like 95% of the difference in our evaluations is just how much we're willing to bet on the defense being okay.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And then I guess to answer my own question, I would go with the Pistons just because
Sure. Yeah.
I would love to see him play with the likes of Jalen Duren. Obviously, you have Asar Thompson as well. And Cade kind of needs, a secondary, obviously it's not Henri Veesaar, but like a secondary ball handling option because, we got rid of Jaden Ivey. And then, obviously we have Duncan Robinson, Karis LeVert. But if you could bring in, a 7-footer that can pick and pop, run the floor with the likes of Cade Cunningham, setting the table for him, and then playing off, Jalen Duren that can, is a ferocious finisher at the rim and that type of athlete, I think he could fit in really nicely in Detroit. But who knows? Who knows where he'll end up?
Yeah, I like that fit a lot because Jalen Duren isn't the same kind of freak that Wemby and Chet are, but he's a freak of a different kind, right? Like he's 6'11" and probably, I mean, Steven Adams isn't playing, so he's by default the strongest guy in the league. It's like he covers up for a lot of Henri Veesaar's defensive holes as well. It's not quite the same sort of rangy big who covers everything from 30 feet out to the rim, but Duren would also allow Veesaar a lot more opportunity to not have as much put on his plate defensively. And then, as you mentioned, I mean, having Veesaar as a safety valve for Cade Cunningham is dangerous.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
All right. So shall we move on to quick hits and wrap this one up, or you have anything else you want to talk about with Veesaar quickly before we get there?
No, all good. Let's do it.
Okay, quick hits. So we're going to go in a wildly different direction than we've ever gone before with our quick hits. I wanted to, and you were so kind to indulge me, talk about the Winter Olympics, which, maybe I shouldn't be admitting this on the No Ceilings NBA Draft Show, but I have definitely watched a lot more Winter Olympics in the last week than I have college / international / NBA basketball. And I had a very specific, very weird take that I want to set up. So I just want to throw to you to, talk more about the Winter Olympics. And we'll try and keep it short because I will ramble on for way too long if we don't. But yeah, it's been a fun time.
Yeah. First of all, though, I mean, obviously everyone knows about Lindsey Vohn's, journey coming back, and I feel for her. I mean, coming out like that, but also have to give her major props for, even trying it on a torn ACL. I mean, that just,
Absolutely insane.
She's a legend,
Yeah.
in the sport, and, maybe she does come back. I mean, she is 41, and, she's one of those, if you were to do like Olympic Mount Rushmore, she would be on there. So sad that, she couldn't, complete, her goal of, competing in Milan, but, happy that she, made an effort at least. And then, that just attributes to, what type of, athlete and person she is as well. And then shout out to, our curling team too. They just lost in the gold medal match, but I forget what the stat was or anything, but it was like the first time in I don't know how long, but I saw that everywhere. And then obviously Ilya, the figure skater. I mean, he just is everywhere I see Nick on social media. I mean, he has a move that he made himself. I forget what it's called, and then he
Quad axel.
Yep. And then obviously the backflips. I mean, he is so fun to watch, and I never knew I could be so into figure skating. But yeah, he's been awesome.
Yeah, Ilya Malin actually works for the weird random thing that I was gonna do later as well. But yeah, I love the Olympics generally, and the Winter Olympics are very fun for multiple different reasons. Shout out to my mom, who I've never shouted out on this podcast before because she hates sports except for the Olympics, and she is an absolute obsessive when it comes to the Olympics. So shout out to you, Mom. But yeah, the weird sort of thing that I wanted to talk about. Well, there was one other thing which I actually want to get your opinion on, but there's a thing with watching the Winter Olympics versus the Summer Olympics, which is watching the Summer Olympics. It's like, I'm not going to pretend that I'd be good at it, but if you gave me a shot put, I could throw it. If you put me on the ski jump, I would die. If you put me on the luge, I would die and probably also kill someone else as I crash out in absolutely abysmal fashion. Like, it is wild to me. I mean, first of all, how people came up with like a whole ton of the sports that are done at the Winter Olympics. You mentioned curling. I don't know what drunken person in Scotland came up with that one, but good work to you, whoever you might be. But it is really funny to sort of be like, yeah, like I can run 100 meters. I'm not gonna, like no one else is gonna lap me, right? But I can run 100 meters. I can't imagine doing so many of the Winter Olympic sports.
Yeah, and like the one of I forget what his name is, but he did a sub 6-minute mile uphill on skis. Like that is insane. Like how is that like I mean you mentioned like the type of events like I couldn't even get like halfway up. So I mean a sub 6 mile like is insane. So I had to shot that up. And it, like with the Summer Olympics too. And I will say I tried to throw shot put in 7th grade, and because I was a softball player, I tried to, throw it as a softball. My elbow doesn't. So that was the end of shot put for me. Have never looked at one since, or even tried to throw one. But yeah, that's what I had to say on that.
Yeah, no, again, completely fair. I'm not pretending that shot put is something that I could do in any, even vaguely capable fashion, but it's like I can imagine myself doing that without dying.
Yes.
Which when that's the bar, it's a lot harder to clear at the Winter Olympics than the Summer Olympics. But the weird thing that I wanted to talk about was, watching the Winter Olympics, as someone who covers sports for a living, but none of the sports in the Winter Olympics. I think one of the most fun parts for me is, watching the first few runs of whatever event it might be and, sort of getting a feel for, okay, this is sort of what the competition looks like, especially for the less familiar sports that are happening at the Winter Olympics. But really the most fun part for me is like getting over the basic hurdle of, okay, I understand the rules, and then getting to the point of sort of realizing this is what it looks like when an Olympic athlete does this, and this is what it looks like when a gold medal winner does this. And
Yeah.
so the weird comparison that I wanted to make is I was watching the women's big air a couple days ago, and the woman who was favored to win the event, she actually ended up getting the silver medal, but the woman who was favored to win the event was a New Zealand snowboarder by the name of Zoe Sadowski-Synnott. And it was the most remarkable thing, watching, some of the earlier qualifiers, because basically they ran it in like reverse order of World Cup standings or whatever. So it was like the best people were clearly going at the end. And watching, the earlier women throw down some absolutely insane snowboard tricks, right? Again, Olympic level athletes, right? And then just watching Zoe Sadowski-Synnott go down the course and how easy it looked.
Mm-hmm.
Like she was just out there for a day in the park doing a 1440 on a snowboard. And, this is me being weird, but I couldn't help but think of Darren Peterson and think of just how many things that are exceptionally difficult for even like the best people at the sport to do. And then watching, the real, top athletes and just the ease with which things that are absolutely impossible for, and, the reason that I was glad you brought up Ilya Mellon is it's the same thing of nobody else on earth can do that quadruple axel. And listening to the figure skating announcers, many of whom have won Olympic medals in their own right, and, them saying, I didn't think I would ever see this done in my lifetime. And, Ilya Malinin isn't quite the same just in the sense of like the raw athleticism and power is very easy to see with him. Whereas, the reason that I brought up Sadowski-Synnott was just, again, it looked so simple. And it wasn't just that this is something that's impossible for normal people to do, because, yeah, obviously it's the Olympics, right? But watching, like, not even the women who were at the bottom of the qualifying, right? It was like watching the women who were finishing in like sixth place and just making it look like, yeah, okay, something that these people who are like in the top 10 in the sport in the world can't do, and just making it look like something you do in a training run. It was absolutely wild.
I mean, that's our first ever, I think, Olympics NBA draft comparison on the Sailing Snick. So
I can't imagine anyone else would have done that. So.
And it's more perfect that you said it, because I couldn't think of anyone else on the team to make that perfect comparison. But yeah, I think too, like with any sport, right, and especially the Olympics, is that you see people before you, people that you look up to, your role models, that they do these tricks of like, I want to learn how to do, a 360 or 180 or whatever. And then it's like, well, I actually like rotated another time. And then, the evolvement of the sport is so, beautiful to watch year after year, so that we see these, never be seen before tricks. And then, Ilya, he's changing, the sport of figure skating too, and becoming, its own kind of sense too. And the one thing I will nab the Olympics on is that it is so hard to, keep track of and to watch because of NBC. So that's why, like any other, sport in the world, right? Obviously they have their own rights and everything, is that you're not seeing the highlights. You're not seeing anything. You have to see it, on TV when it's live, which, is, I don't like it in the sense because, like if you're working during the day and stuff, you're not going to be able to see, these cool moments, right, all the time. But or you'll see, the picture of it, because that's what, these accounts can share. They can't, they don't have the rights or, copyright rights to, share those videos, which sucks, right? Because you want these athletes to be celebrated, every single sense of, how other, athletes in every sport are, with the sharing of highlights. So that's one thing I will nab on. But, when you're watching, the Olympics on your TV or whatever. I mean, it's so awesome, right? And I think too, comparing summer to the Winter Olympics is that, you mentioned just the events are so obscure and like, you're like, how the heck do they think of, let's, race up a hill, let's do a mile up the hill and skis. Like, it's crazy.
I don't remember where or who it was from, but I saw the other day the perfect perfect comparison in my mind, which is the Summer Olympic triathlon is you swim and then you bike and then you run. And the Winter Olympics version of the triathlon is the biathlon, which is you cross country ski for 10 kilometers and then you shoot things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unreal. It's unreal.
Just wild. But I will make one more comparison between the Olympics and the draft, the NBA draft, which is a much broader comparison, but I think a very important one. Of the best moments of any Olympics are the moments when the athlete realizes that they're going to end up on the podium. Mm-hmm. And it's the same joy that I get of watching the NBA draft. And it's like, I am watching live in real time someone who has spent their entire life working towards this moment finally achieve their dreams. And it's such a beautiful thing. And, not to get too dark, but like in the current climate in many sorts of different ways, looping back to our climate change discussion at the very beginning of the podcast, it is really, really nice to just get to turn on the TV and see people who have put in just incredible amounts of time, work, effort, the athletes, their families, their coaches, the training staffs, everybody involved in it. And that one special moment happens when somebody realizes, oh, my dream's going to get to come true. I'm going to get to hold that Olympic medal up on the stage, and that is forever. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to overstate how special that is.
Yeah, it's one of the best things you could possibly watch or witness, like in your lifetime, especially with any sport, and especially like with the draft too, when their dreams come true, on the podium, and they're walking up to Adam Silver. It's kind of just like, this is so awesome. Like, this is what it's all about type of moments. And especially like I witnessed this feeling too, when Judah, Jake Paul's wife, set the Olympic record in speed skating too. I mean, it was so like emotions were flying. Like it's such pure joy too, Nick. It doesn't matter, what type of athlete you are, could be from the smallest level to, Olympics, that sense of, accomplishment is second to none.
And it's one of those things also where, one of the other things that this is just a weird minor thing that I just tend to notice throughout the Olympics is all these people, pretty much all these athletes have an Olympic ring tattoo somewhere. It's almost always on their arm, but they have it somewhere. And it's like, this isn't just the people who end up on the medal stand, right? Every single person who has ever been a part of any Olympic Games gets to say, yeah, I'm an Olympic athlete, and it's just, again, it's just so awesome to see, like, yeah, my dream is coming true. And you can tell my dream is coming true because I've got an Olympic tattoo on my arm, and here I am.
Yeah, that's the coolest thing ever, honestly. Because, if I was to, like, I for sure 100% get an Olympic tattoo. Because I feel like at that point, you have to, whether you have tattoos or not. But yeah.
I think I might have to get like Yemeni citizenship or something and be like the Yemeni candidate for cross country skiing and be dead last by like, 3 times as long as the race is for everybody else. But I get to say, hey, I'm an Olympic athlete. Don't worry about where I placed. Don't worry about if I qualified for anything after the first round. It's like, hey, Olympic athlete.
Guys, I promise I was in the Olympics. Like you might have not seen me, but I swear.
Here's the picture. Here's a picture of the starting line. I'm not going to show you what happens after the gun fires, but here's me at the starting line.
Yeah, that'd be me for sure.
All right. Anything else before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, all good.
All right. Well, she is Paige Otto. You can find her on social media at PaigeOtto_, and you can find her written work on NoCeilingsNBA.com. You can find me on social media at NBA Johnson, and you can find my written work on NoCeilingsNBA.com. not to count my chickens before they hatch, but I am planning on writing an article for next week that is currently in progress. So that may be our quick hits for next time. We'll see how it goes, if I like how it turns out or not, but that will be in the works. So be sure to be on the lookout for that on NoCeilingsNBA.com. If you've been enjoying the show, please be sure to rate and review if you're listening to the podcast, or leave a like and subscribe if you are watching the show on YouTube. All of that always much appreciated on our end. And if you have any feedback regarding the deep dive specific portion of the podcast, feel free to reach out either via social media, or you can send me an email, nickaj.nba@gmail.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.